Thanks, everybody. Today, I'm excited to present to you some of the EPIC Group's recent work in uncertainty-aware modeling and the use of these models in risk-averse control. Certainly been a team effort across the entire group, but I'd particularly like to highlight the contributions of Frank Jamu and Thomas Lev. All right, so what do we mean by driving at the limits of handling? Well, what we mean by this is actually operating the vehicle up to the limits, the friction limits of the tires. So actually bringing the vehicle all the way to its edges of its capabilities and actually sliding it across the road. So in competitive motorsports, this is a fairly common occurrence, both in racing and in other methods such as drifting. So here in this top-down view, you can see the autonomous test vehicle drifting a figure eight. If you're not familiar with drifting, drifting means cornering in this extreme oversteer attitude. So you notice the vehicle has its nose pointed like well into the corner, and it's actually sliding sideways as it goes around the trajectory. Outside of motorsports, these capabilities have real-world applications. So the same abilities that let us control the vehicle in these extreme situations allow us to do things like drive in adverse conditions like snow and ice, and they allow us to maintain control of the vehicle when dealing with emergencies on the road, such as animals that could run out in front of you. All right. Often the way this is done in our group and others is through model predictive control. So in model predictive control, you have a mechanism for predicting how the control inputs you make now and in the future will impact the trajectory of your vehicle. Then, according to your objectives, which you encode as a cost function, you can optimize your inputs across this trajectory to get your desired behavior. So you can race around the track and avoid obstacles, or you can drift with such a framework. Maybe kind of one note for the latter part of the talk is depending on how you set up your optimization problem and parameterize your objective function, these controllers can actually serve kind of a range of use cases. You can use them from anything from pure trajectory tracking all the way to up to trajectory optimization and even motion planning in some settings. And these, with tuning and refinement, these can actually work quite well. So this is some work that the group did a couple years ago demonstrating autonomous drifting on a racetrack for the first time. So this will give you a slightly different perspective on drifting and help you understand kind of where the current state of the art is.
Going autonomous.
Temporarily giving an ordinary driver
whenever you're ready
the drifting skills of an expert.
All right, so that kind of gave you some idea of what we could do with existing deterministic MPC and vehicle models that are hand-tuned and hand-engineered. So while it's capable of great performance, there is some trade-offs, right? So to get these controllers to work reliably, you have to do a number of rounds of testing, tuning, and iteration. This can be a problem when the vehicle's behavior is actually changing. So for example, if you're operating on new tires or on a new surface for the first time, you want your controllers that you're deploying to be reliable. So these have kind of motivated our two research questions that we're currently exploring. How we can get controllers that perform robustly so that we can deploy them in novel situations with high confidence, and as we gather more data about a given operating regime, how we can reduce the uncertainty to allow us to continue to optimize the vehicle's performance. That is, extract every bit that it has to give. All right, so the way we've chosen to pursue this is through stochastic differential equations. For those of you who are unfamiliar, you kind of have a deterministic term exactly in an ordinary differential equation. So this would be your traditional vehicle or system model and control. But you also have some external disturbances through some sort of stochastic process. So these would represent things like bouncing over, over bumps on the road or other sorts of external disturbances. However, also for our setting, we also have internal model uncertainty. So when we're driving at the limits of friction, something we are sensitive to is how much grip there is actually between the tires and the road. So here we describe that as mu of the tires, and we could model it as, for example, having some normal distribution with a mean of 0.95 being about right for dry asphalt, but that could range down to 0.7 on wet roads or down to 0.3 or 0.2 on snow and ice. All right, so in some sense, what we're trying to do is we're trying to accurately model through stochastic differential equations the possible behavior of our vehicle. And then at the same time, we want to be able to estimate the parameters that describe its behavior. All right, so that brings me to the work that I'm going to talk about today. So we're going to have this part in kind of two parts, the longer and former of which will be modeling efforts through stochastic differential equations using neural SDEs to capture some of that diffusion noise that we have in SDEs that we don't have in our ODE models. Then we'll look at diffusion models as a mechanism to capture parametric uncertainty of the vehicle model itself. And finally, we'll end with a look at uncertainty-aware controllers, so how we can kind of go beyond trajectory tracking to actually reason about the appropriate plans you should make given your current level of uncertainty. So if we're to learn our vehicle dynamics from data, imagine that we want to make good predictions of the vehicle trajectory given a set of control inputs from your current state. So this is effectively the model that we need for model predictive control. Importantly, some things that we might want our model to do are, where there's lots of training data, we want high accuracy, and we would expect there to be relatively low uncertainty in the vehicle's behavior. So what we've shown here is that where there's not data, we have correspondingly large bands of uncertainty in this kind of qualitative picture. Another important property, though, is that there could be various or varying uncertainty across the vehicle state space. So, for example, in certain situations, such as driving in a straight line, you would expect there to be very, very little difference in the vehicle's behavior. You expect the behavior to be quite predictable. As you kind of get out to the friction limits and you're operating in these more unstable regimes, you would expect like a correspondingly large dispersion in your data, and you would want your model to capture some of that. Okay, so that's kind of the high-level conceptual view. Let's look at how we actually apply this to autonomous vehicles itself. And so again, there's these two terms within the SDE. First, we want to capture the physical nature of our vehicle, keeping in mind what we know about the underlying physics. So these could be certain things that we bring in as side information, such as energy conservation or symmetry of the system. In practice, for the vehicle, this comes down to modeling the tire forces at the front and the rear axles, which are hard to model and predict. But then the way they act on the vehicle itself are actually quite straightforward, right? We know the moment arm and we know the mass of the vehicle to fairly high certainty. Then, similarly to what I described on the previous slide, we want to be able to parameterize or estimate through a neural network our associated uncertainty. Where you have data, you would expect that uncertainty to be low, and you want that modeled uncertainty to grow as you get outside of the distribution of your training data. Okay, looking more specifically, if we're to look at a simple schematic of a vehicle under control, we have a front axle and a rear axle. These generate a lumped longitudinal and lateral force that we can predict through a tire model, here exponential tan h, which encodes desirable properties in the tire model. This model is then parameterized through a neural network. All right, so I'm going to dwell briefly on how we use these SDE models for control, particularly for drifting. So our cost function encodes two objectives. One is to track a path. So this is kind of given to us for our current purposes. And we also want to track not just the path, but a desired side slip angle, so how sideways the car is. So this is kind of what makes drifting unique as a maneuvering technique in car control. All right, so standard MPC framework, we can incorporate box constraints on the controls. Importantly, we are not considering any state constraints at the moment. This is simply a controls problem. Then we can sample a number of, we can extract a number of samples from our stochastic process that represent our disturbances, and we can then effectively roll out a number of particles given these disturbances, right? So these kind of, through a Monte Carlo approach, you can characterize the possible spread of trajectories for your current control inputs. Then what you can do is you can optimize in expectation your cost function. And this includes not just the cost over the finite horizon of your trajectory, but also any sort of estimate of your cost to go. So terminal cost in MPC parlance. All right. So let's look at a few experimental results and compare how this performs against the deterministic MPC we saw at the beginning. On simple donut trajectories with the autonomous Supra, performance improves over the standard deterministic model. We can see reductions in both tracking error in how close we are to the path, also how accurately we can track our side slip. So this is an improvement overall. Similarly, for figure eights, we see kind of a comparable trend, good side slip tracking accuracy, and slight improvement in lateral error. I should emphasize that this is actually the setting in which the baseline MPC has been tuned. So in some sense, both controllers are performing well here, and what's not important so much is the difference. I think this holds true even more for this other example on the Lexus LC500 test vehicle you see here. So here we're comparing not against the hand-engineered model, but against the fully connected neural network model of the vehicle's dynamics. So again, in kind of goldenrod here, we see this highly accurate deterministic MPC. So in some sense, this is maybe the most accurate description we can have of the vehicle's dynamics at this current operating point. Again, the tracking of the SDE model is comparable. Important to note here, though, that this is a different SDE model than what we use to control the Supra. Of course, you have to have training data sets that are unique to that specific car. Which isn't great when the conditions you're operating in could change very substantially, right? You could have roads go from dry to wet. You could have the tires on your autonomous vehicle changed, and you could not have information about this. Or you could have degradation of your vehicle systems itself, and you want to be able to adapt to that. And so we've started to explore diffusion models as a mechanism to do exactly that. So why look at diffusion models? Well, I think our main motivation is that a lot of existing uncertainty quantification techniques tend to look at multimodal distributions. They tend to look at, they do a good job of fitting single modes in the data and associated bands of uncertainty, but they don't necessarily capture some of the multimodality that we would expect to see in vehicle data again. So some examples of this could be different surface conditions like dry roads, wet roads, and snow. But these could also be like various models or classes of tires. However, importantly for our purposes, we want to be able to leverage diffusion models and their capabilities to represent multimodal distributions without giving up some of the same benefits that we had in these physically informed SDE models that we've been using. So the approach we've taken is actually to just combine them in sequence. So the diffusion model's job is actually to, based on the vehicle's recent state and its evolution, so basically from your observations of how the vehicle is handling, produce an estimate of the vehicle, of the parameters for your vehicle model. And so for a neural SDE, this could be on the order of hundreds of parameters. We can then use this slowly updating model within our very fast MPC loop to do control. With the goal being to have increased confidence in your performance since you're adapting the parameters of your vehicle model online. Okay, so where does the diffusion model come from? Well, we can train it offline, spend significant time doing that, and then we can then deploy it relatively quickly online. So the algorithm that we're using to do this is to take our existing data set, which kind of characterizes the entire multimodal distribution that you want to model. So this could be data sets from multiple cars, multiple models of tires, surface conditions. Really, in some sense, you want this to be as broad as possible. We then break this down into many, many smaller segments of fractions of several seconds. Then to each of those, we can use our existing fitting techniques to fit parameters of our nonlinear model. So that's happening here. Then, I guess as standard as in diffusion models, we can corrupt those parameter sets with noise and train a diffusion model to remove the noise from our parameters. Importantly, the diffusion model is conditioned on the recent transitions in the vehicle state. Okay. And then everything you see here is kind of, this is just a more detailed example of the use of the parameters within MPC that we saw on the previous slide. All right, so before we get to the experimental results, I'll show briefly some evidence that, in fact, one, these parameters are multimodal, and two, that our model is able to disambiguate between them based on recent data. All right, so here we see for two different parameters that are part of our SDE model. One is the inertia of the wheel, and the other is kind of the max rear tire force. What this effectively is your friction coefficient. You can see that when the vehicle is in what we've termed grip conditions, so driving in a straight line, you're not able to characterize these quantities very accurately. You have high distribution, and in particular, this one is quite multimodal. So what these probably are data from our two separate test vehicles that make up the data set. However, once the vehicle is actually in a drift and sliding, you can see that that uncertainty collapses fairly significantly, and we get a single mode in our distribution. Obviously, we would hope that you could then use this to do higher performance control. All right, so let's see how this works. So previously, we saw that we could use the same modeling technique to control two different cars with bespoke vehicle models for those two vehicles. Here, we ask the question, can we use this diffusion model framework to drift both of our test vehicles? So both the highly modified Supra and the stock LC500. And it turns out that you can. So we can deploy the same controller framework to both of them, and with great success in fairly varied trajectories. So again, the donuts we saw earlier, as well as figure eights, and importantly, this kind of more complex demo trajectory at the bottom, which is actually identical between the two vehicles. So, great. So that's what we could do in California, but my earlier motivating example was what about conditions like rain or snow? And so we don't have opportunities to test in those regularly. So we look to our colleagues in Japan who have access to a wet skid pad. So soaked here. Here, what we're testing is the same diffusion model that produced those previous results, but with its training data set augmented with a couple minutes of wet data. So having seen just a little bit of wet data, we can augment the diffusion model to have good performance in wet and dry, hopefully. So will it work? it does. Even though the friction is, about 25% less than most of our training data would suggest, and all of our previous testing enjoyed, you can see that we're able to stabilize the car on a circular drift trajectory. Also, interestingly, here you can kind of see the marks left on the tires on successful laps. So, in some sense, you can see the repeatability of path tracking. The external video is cool, but sometimes you want to see it from inside the car as well. So this is what that same data set looks like from the perspective of the test driver. I also like this video because it kind of gives you a perspective on how small the steering correction you can make to actually balance the vehicle and to keep it sliding in play. Right, so that kind of concludes the focus on our stochastic models and how we've captured both like inherent variation across trajectories, but also parametric uncertainty of the vehicle itself. And we've seen that we can actually use a parameter estimation approach based on diffusion models to actually drift vehicles, different vehicles across vastly different situations. In closing, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of our ongoing work in using these models for risk-aware control. So everything you saw to date was the tracking of a target trajectory. Now, the natural question is, who gives you the trajectory, right? And how can you incorporate some of this uncertainty in order to operate with an appropriate level of caution on the road? So we've been starting to look at an approach done by Thomas Lev and with Marco, actually, when he was back in his PhD, which is based on an average value at risk approach. So to give you a high level, say, imagine you're planning a trajectory around some obstacles. This could be an emergency obstacle avoidance maneuver, for example. Based on your SDE, you would have some variation in the vehicle's response, and you would have some trajectories that violate your constraints, right? So what you would do is you would represent your constraints, say non-collision, as some function g, which we want to be less than 0 for safety. Then you would say with something like 5% probability as an example, you want that to be less than 0. Or sorry, excuse me. With no more than 5% probability, you want the value of g should be more than 0. So this means you'll be safe in at least 95% of the cases. Then we also, or what Thomas has done, is introduce this average value at risk notion, which is actually the value of this tail, the average value of the elements g in this tail here. So importantly, the average value at risk is always greater than this value. So if this is less than 0, then this definitely is. So it's a slightly conservative one, and it's easier to work with mathematically. The question then becomes, how do you solve this? And while there's various approaches in the literature, most of them leverage simplifying assumptions that make them less than ideal for our question of driving at the limits, where we're dealing with highly nonlinear dynamics, potentially some state uncertainty from perception, as well as these twin uncertainties in parameters and external disturbances that I described earlier. So the approach we're using is to tackle this through, again, a Monte Carlo method, much like we saw in the relatively unconstrained control case earlier. Again, what we want to do is enforce this average value at risk constraint over a sampled set of M trajectories. And this can be solved relatively efficiently with nonlinear programming. As nice theoretical guarantees, as you increase the number of samples, your answer actually should, or can be proven to converge to the exact solution. So what does this mean for drifting? So our simulation results suggest that potentially we can improve performance even more, particularly when we're operating in scenarios where we have hard constraints or things that we really don't want to hit. So here in this kind of pale red, you would see no-go zones, regions we absolutely need to stay out of. A baseline deterministic MPC can track its nominal trajectory perfectly when staying outside the zones when it matches the model exactly. In contrast, this average value at risk formulation has to cheat the vehicle's trajectory away from these obstacles. So you actually have to pay a higher penalty in your path tracking performance. However, when there's a difference between the model used for simulation and for control, the picture looks very different. So with a relatively modest reduction between friction and used in the model and within simulation, you see either constraint violations or spinouts. And I will point out that this is a much smaller reduction than we saw between dry roads and wet roads, for example, in the preceding examples. In contrast, the risk-averse MPC is able to stabilize the car and to keep it away from the obstacle. So this is, in some sense, exactly what we were hoping for. We can see that we give away some peak performance in exchange for increased robustness when we're uncertain. Right. So where to from here? Well, while we can solve these things relatively efficiently, we want to get it to the point where we could potentially use this as a real-time MPC on the car. And so some of the work that the group is doing is looking at GPU parallelization to keep the compute time from growing linearly with the number of samples, as well as looking at other methods like importance sampling to make sure that we use no more than the number of samples that we need. Okay. So to conclude, hopefully you've enjoyed learning a little bit about our modeling approaches for both internal dynamic parametric uncertainty, as well as the modeling of external disturbances, and how we've used these controllers both in real-time control on the vehicle across various situations, and how we're looking at using them in planning for safe operation, even up to the vehicle's performance limits. With that, I'll take any questions. Come on. Yeah, and in fact, if you're aiming at real time, with our current implementations at least, if you're aiming at real time use, potentially even fewer, like 5 to 10. Interestingly, though, you do gain some, 5 and 10 is actually enough to see substantial benefit relative to 1. So again, does it guarantee? No, but it changes the behavior in a meaningful way.
Great presentation. I like the demo very much, and I want to know how do you define the size of the data set for your learning model? Because we know if we gather more data for your learning model, your performance should be better and better. But if you gather many data, it will influence your computation time for your controller. So how do you balance this?
Well, I think you raise an interesting point, and I think I will draw a small distinction between the Gaussian processes that you're using in your work and the diffusion models that we're using here. So, and again, I guess Marco used a rather pithy phrase this morning in that something like train hard and make inference easy. And what effectively we're doing here is we're preloading all the computation within the diffusion model. So as your data set grows and as you add more diverse data, the amount of time you'll need to train that diffusion model does grow. However, that doesn't matter because you can do that ahead of time, and then you can take the trained model and deploy it on the car. Inference time on the diffusion model then is more a function of how many denoising steps you need to take and how expensive it is to do inference on your model. And these things are actually relatively fixed regardless of the size of your data set. So, yeah. Marco.
great talk that I enjoyed. I think all these models and your ideas the point of the VFD was actually very valuable. Now, I was curious for your neural models, for example, the diffusion models that you use, how sensitive they are to the fact that it looks like most of the data collection was around a specific operating system. Have you tried to see to what extent they are generalizable or can we create fairly soon and thereby doing additional data?
Yeah. So if I understand your question correctly, I think it's about generalization of the models. So across the state space, that's actually where the physically motivated aspects of the neural SDE become extremely important. And I didn't dwell on it too much in this talk, but it's actually been tackled in a couple stages. So one is understanding how the tire forces influence the vehicle, modeling that with a specific class of function, which has properties that we know are appropriate for a tire model. So we know that it will generalize well at high slope angles, for example. And then only that, so we tried and couldn't use a fully connected network for predicting tire forces because that didn't generalize appropriately. However, by kind of encoding prior information about tire models, we were able to ensure that could. And then only then do we use the neural network to produce parameters for that model. So
that's for the neural,
yeah,
so for the
diffusion.
Maybe giving guidance to the diffusion output or
So yeah, let me for a second. So how do you know the diffusion model doesn't produce a set of vehicle model parameters that have no correspondence to your data? It's a good question. I think it can be tackled in two parts, or I think maybe more accurately, it would be accurate to say, I think there's two reasons it's worked well in practice for us so far. One is that you're actually fitting parameters. We're using our existing model fitting pipeline to create the target set for the diffusion model. So if that's relatively robust and stable, and we can bring in information there about masses, inertias, reasonable friction limits, and things like that, then your target distribution for your diffusion model will be pretty good. The second is kind of more of a runtime monitor, effectively, that we use online. So the diffusion model can produce an entire set of candidate parameters. And then before we actually use them for control, we can see how well these models actually explain recent observed behavior. And so this kind of, that was implemented, yeah. So it's a relatively quick to check them and see how well they're behaving online before we use it for control. It's actually quite a bit cheaper than running the diffusion model. So, thanks.
Also, I was wondering if you could comment on scaling this approach to, say, public roadways where there are sort of geometric considerations, like the curves are and where the roadway and lanes and whatnot, and still this like drifting application. Like how can you comment on the scalability in terms of perhaps still using a small amount of data for this kind of approach?
So let me just kind of paraphrase or clarify your question. So the question is it around how we could use these vehicle models in real world driving scenarios, and then or how we could apply some of the uncertainty aware planning techniques? Yeah.
So like your test cases are in like open roads,
Yeah.
But generally there would be lanes and barriers and concrete, and the roadways look different from one place to another. So like, I'm imagining like drifting in like snowy conditions or in rainy conditions, like in regular driving and applying these techniques. to
Okay.
open-
Sure, sure. Um, yeah, so I think really it comes down to having a decent representation of the world in a format that's appropriate for MPC. And so we've actually done this quite a bit in our on racetrack work. So you can, represent the road edges within the MPC as, soft constraints. Instead of the edges of the racetrack, they could be the edges of your lane, for example. And I would expect that to work relatively well. The thing that we haven't tackled so much from a research perspective, and I think I'm not sure that it's research so much as an engineering question, is how do you get the parameters that your MPC requires from a representation of the world itself, whether this be perception or some sort of high fidelity map.